This video is sponsored by Lighter Creative. More about them later on. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and it's time for another episode of the best armies in Warhammer 40k, the weekly video series where we go through undefeated results from the past week of competitive play. And this is a fairly big weekend with lots of event results and a fairly diverse meta, including a brand new leader at the forefront of the competitive 40k metagame. Moving on to a metagame breakdown, we can see that is in fact Chaos Space Marines, who have 4 undefeated results at the Cornwall Super Bash, Broadsword Wargaming Major, March for McCrag, and Southeastern Slaughter GT. They edged out other metagame frontrunners that we've seen success from in the last couple of months, including Necrons, who still had 3 undefeated results this week at the Broadsword Wargaming Major, Phoenix Spring GT, and 4th Annual Blue Ridge Championship. That Broadsword Wargaming Major was one of the largest events of the weekend and had almost 100 players. However, it only ran 5 rounds, and so we ended up with a lot of undefeated players from that particular event, although it was kind of indicative of the current metagame, since we do see the 3rd place finishing faction also doing well at that event, going undefeated, that being Thousand Suns, who also took down the Gamers XP Luck of the Emperor GT, as well as the Dice Like Ice GT. Ultramarines continue to do well, although most of their events came from the Sydney GT, where both 1st and 2nd place were Ultramarines. They also took down the Iron Cage Bedford Beatdown. We've seen a little bit of success in the newest format from Tyranids, and that continues, with Tyranids putting down 2 undefeated results and taking down 2 events, those being Battle on the Bayou as well as Catocon. And other Space Marine chapters, in addition to Ultramarines, also continuing to do well. Deathwatch has seen recent success and keeps that up with wins at the Cornwall Super Bash as well as the Warvel Open 2026. Dark Angels took down the 4th Annual Blue Ridge Championship. Black Templars went undefeated at the Dark Sphere March GT. And moving on to other Imperium factions, we also saw strong results from Adeptus Custodes winning the North and South GT, Imperial Knights winning Warmaster of the Asylum, Adeptus Mechanicus, who ended up winning the Dark Sphere March GT, with Black Templars taking 2nd place. We also saw some Chaos factions doing well. Death Guard won the GT Asturias. World Eaters won the Black Crow Gaming Battle of the Ragnar GT. Chaos Demons with an undefeated result from the Wheat City Open. And other Xenos factions also getting some results in there. Tau Empire winning the Kelpie Crusade, a little bit low for this faction that I think a lot of people expect to do very well, although I will mention that while it is not street official yet, this list did use the new Twinland. However, I'm not sure how many other events allowed its inclusion, since it's only been a little bit since its street release. On top of that, Orks also won the Mance GT3, and last but certainly not least, Drukhari took down the VT 40k March GT. And with that, let's move on to talking about these lists in particular, just after a word from our sponsors. This video has been sponsored by Lighter Creative, one of the biggest supporters of the channel and one of my favorite sponsors. And in the past, Lighter Creative has been the producers of incredible quality gaming mats, including mats that have grids and deployment zones demarcated on them, as well as WTC compatible terrain. However, one of my other favorite things is chapter-proof 2025 terrain. We use it online for my event series, and that's what I typically play on when I go to tournaments. And now these two tastes can taste great together, because Lighter Creative is responsible for a new line of gorgeous looking chapter-approved 2025 terrain sets. These babies are made out of high quality, high density board and include some absolutely gorgeous printed artwork. The sets come stock with a very cool semi-translucent base system. They do outline the edges of the terrain features so you can easily see where the ruins end. On top of that, unlike a ton of other MDF or board-based terrain systems, the Lighter Creative versions are not complex to put together. These new chapter-proof 2025 terrain features go together snugly and sturdily, but are only composed of 1, 2, or maybe 3 pieces. In this case, that allows you to either flip them back and forth, allowing for a single set to make all of the terrain layouts in the CA 2025 tournament packet without having to get additional pieces. I'm always impressed by Lighter Creative's terrain offerings, and this is no different. And it's nice to see them support more terrain formats than just WTC. So check out the links in the video description or scan the QR code on screen now to get access to yours. And big thanks to Lighter Creative for sponsoring the video. Let's get back to the content. Now we're going to start by moving on to our metagame frontrunner, Chaos Space Marines, and go to one of the largest events of the weekend, the 119-player Cornwall Super Bash, to discuss this list. This was one of the few 6-round events of the weekend. And going 6-0 was Jonathan Summerfield, who ran an absolutely insane Renegade Raiders list. This featured not only a huge element of backline vehicle-based shooting, but also many of the new inclusions from the new Red Corsairs unit line. This included Cypher, Fabius Bile. We did have a big unit of 10 chosen for Fabius Bile to hop into, Huron Blackheart, and Vashtor the Archifane. Now, Vashtor is being enabled by a trio of Forge Fiends in the list. That's right, not just one Forge Fiend. All 3 Forge Fiends getting the strength bonus from Vashtor the Archifane, so they could go up to strength 12, kill T12 and T11 profiles fairly effectively, which are incredibly popular right now. We also see a Cultist Mob for backline screening, in addition to 3 Chaos Rhinos, 2 units of 3 Chaos Bikers for some utility, as well as a massive unit of 10 Red Corsair Raiders. Now, the big benefit of these guys is that they are incredibly high OC infiltrators. Now, while we did include several attachment options for the Red Corsairs here, the downside is that if any of them do choose to attach, my understanding is that the Red Corsairs will lose infiltrators because the units themselves that are either joining or attaching into the Red Corsairs don't themselves have the infiltrate keyword, which means because the entire unit doesn't have infiltrating, the unit would have to deploy in the backline. This speaks to me that I think Huron Blackheart and the Masters of the Maelstrom are hanging out by themselves, and the Red Corsairs are being used as an early game aggressive piece. Well, you could create a huge brick of these guys, which are relatively inexpensive high wound count infantry. I'm not 100% sure that's how they were being used. You do lose a keyword on that, and also I'm not really sure how you transport them. Their list does include 3 Chaos Rhinos, but doesn't have too many actual transport options for the Chaos Rhinos because a lot of the build is composed of vehicles and mounted units. That said, we do have independent characters like Cypher, for example, so we could have Cypher drop into a Chaos Rhino early or potentially even the Cultist Mob, although usually you want them to start on an objective. You could then put Huron and the Masters of the Maelstrom in the second Rhino and then place Fabius Bile into a third Rhino. That gives you lots of utility and good delivery systems for all of those units, in addition to having this huge brick of infiltrating raiders in order to instigate the fight in the early game. Huron himself does have a reactive move for his unit, so having him be able to embark into Rhinos as the game continues on does make a lot of sense to me. It does give you a pretty good offset for the downside of the Red Corsairs, which is that they come in at only strength 5 AP 1. If you are playing Renegade Raiders, these guys are incredibly good at stealing objectives, but also fighting on an objective brings them up to AP 2. And we can use Reaver's Haste to advance and charge to get those guys into those positions. So it would make sense to me if these Red Corsairs ended up being played as an independent unit. However, obviously the opportunity is there if you give up that infiltration to attach all those characters into it and make a big giant 16 model brick if you really feel like you need it. Pretty interesting list. You have tons and tons of aggressive infantry between the Masters of the Maelstrom, the Red Corsairs, and Fabius Bile's unit that can all protect these Forge Fiends that are getting the buff from Vashtor the Archifane to just continuously advance around the table, shoot consistently. The nice thing about getting assault on those big heavy guns is that it allows them to reposition and in ways that your opponent may not necessarily expect them to. If you roll a 6 on an advance, it can give you a really cheeky angle onto something important, and that can be hugely profitable for these big multi-damage blast weapons. Definitely a weird list incorporating a lot of really interesting kind of sub-packages that Chaos Space Marines have access to, and it's really cool to see them all come together in a way that's unique. Now, moving on from there, we're going to hop over to one of the other large events of the weekend, that being the Broadsword Wargaming Major. This was a almost 100-player event, 98 players, and ended up being won by Chaos Space Marines, but we also saw both Necrons and Thousand Suns, the 2 metagame runners-up, also doing well. In this case, we're going to talk about Necrons for this one, where Simon Quinn went 5-0. With a Canoptek Court detachment. Cool to see a little bit of classic Canoptek Court back in. I feel like it's been 2 years or so since this build was really meta. But it does have a new lease on life with the inclusion of the new Catan shards, and those are obviously surviving their 10-point cost increase pretty well with their inclusion in this build. In this case, we are taking Deceiver, Nightbringer, and Void Dragon in terms of Catan shards. The nice thing that these guys will do is that they will give you a very relatively efficient sort of high resilience melee counterpunch to follow up the incredibly consistent front line that Canoptek Court can give you. This gives you lots of defensive stratagems and rerolls for your Canoptek units, which includes things like Wraiths and Doomstalkers. So a lot of times what you can do is you can kind of gum up the middle of the table with these Wraiths and try to postpone the game for long enough that you'll eventually be able to win with your pretty solid Necron utility units. In this case, you can create that front line in order to allow the Catan shards to then sort of push up into the midboard without having to worry about being overwhelmed because the Wraiths can keep enemies off their back. So in this case, we're also bringing a Technomancer with Dimensional Sanctum to give his unit infiltrate. We're also bringing a trio of Canoptek Doomstalkers to make use of the Canoptek Court rerolls. We have a unit of Canoptek Tomb Crawlers that can hang out with the Technomancer inside a Wraith unit. Speaking of which, there is one Wraith unit in here equipped with Particle Casters, in addition to a bunch of utility. 2 units of Tomb Blades, as well as a unit of Deathmarks and a unit of Flayed Ones, just to perform those utility roles. Obviously, especially things like the high OC Tomb Blade units are relatively important here because you do want to establish midboard control so that the Doomstalkers and the Wraiths can push forward and still get access to that power matrix. So being able to include fast, aggressive units in addition to the Wraiths themselves is going to make those Canoptek units significantly more consistent. Obviously, it doesn't provide any benefit to the Catan shards, but they don't necessarily need that much synergy. Now, with that, we're going to move over to the third place finisher from that same event, the Broadsword Wargaming Major. In this case, it was Yoan Brown, who was playing Thousand Suns in a Rubricae Phalanx, but not any variety of Rubricae Phalanx. We've seen a lot of different incarnations of this particular detachment, usually revolving around 30 Scarab Occult Terminators. I think it's relatively straightforward, and it is a bit of a skew. It's kind of a heavy infantry skew. If you do hit stuff that's good at clearing heavy infantry or good at engaging these units on a wide frontage, this detachment can fall apart pretty quickly. Now, this list actually is significantly different than almost any Rubricae Phalanx we've seen before. I think it's sick. This includes an Exalted Sorcerer with Arcane Thralls. That's a bit of a point filler to give reroll Battle Shock tests to Rubric units within 9 inches. It only costs you 5 points, and it occasionally comes up, so it's never bad to have on your list. However, from there, we also have a Terminator Sorcerer with Lord of the Rubricae, which can give +1 to his unit's hit roll. The nice thing about that is that it allows you to spread out the +1 to hit. The nice thing about this is that it allows you to get that benefit without having to select a single target. So when the unit is split firing, you're always going to get the +1 to hit. Because the Terminator Sorcerer already gives a +1 to hit bonus, it can feel a little redundant, but oftentimes you'll end up firing your bolters and your smaller weapons from a Scarab Occult unit, and then your missile launchers and your Soul Reaper cannons, for example, and your psychic powers into a second target, and being able to split fire and still hit on 2s is a big deal. The other thing is that this affects your melee attacks as well, which means that these guys, once they're stuck into melee, aren't going to be quite as pillow-fisted as normal Thousand Suns units. Now, for attachment for him, we do have 3 Scarab Occult Terminator units, but 2 of them are only units of 5. The last one is that big unit of 10, which I assume the Lord of the Rubricae is attaching into. And in addition to that, we also have the big man himself, Magnus the Red, which is actually kind of a shocking inclusion. Now, this guy makes the Kabbalistic rituals for the army significantly more consistent, which is a real downside of playing non-Grand Coven Thousand Suns, is that their army ability becomes kind of a crapshoot whether or not you get it off. And getting 2 consistent +2 to cast psychic rituals out of Magnus himself does mean that he's useful in basically any of these detachments. It doesn't have any redundancy for its ritual casting. The downside is that without access to the full reroll stratagem that Grand Coven gives him, Magnus Red, oh boy, is he tough to get his value from for 430 points, almost close to a quarter of your army. He does feel a little bit underpowered sometimes. However, in a build like this, where you are trying to kind of pull focus away from the Scarab Occults themselves, being able to present this big brick, this big guy who's toughness 11, a 2+ save, -1 damage, in addition to all of your Scarab Occult Terminators at the same time, can force your opponent to split their attacks in a big way and make it kind of difficult to deal with all of those different units coming in. So he's good in the early game because he's going to be able to get those rituals off consistently, and then he's good in the mid to late game as you kind of try to overwhelm your opponent with these Rubric units. But that's not all, because the list also includes 4 units of 5 Rubric Marines. Now, these guys are actually an incredible inclusion in Rubricae Phalanx. I'm actually I'm surprised we don't see Rubric Marines taken more often. The nice thing about them is that that they do get the detachment ability, so they get a situational +1 to their saving throws, but they also are only 100 points, and they're relatively good at fighting other utility units. You can commit them, move them forward, disembark them for a Rhino, get the benefits from that, and then also, Temporal Surge, then push them up to engage other units that are taking objectives without having to commit Scarab Occult Terminator units, which is oftentimes the downside of this list, which is that you only often have maybe 4 or 5 reasonable activations on the table. So when you're called upon to do actions or take your opponent's objectives, you have to commit 500 points worth of Scarab Occult Terminators to do so. Taking Unit 2/5 Rubricae allows you to interact in a much more meaningful way with your opponent's lighter units. In addition to that, we also have those 2 5-man Scarab Occult Terminator units, so this army is actually much better at trading than you would see from a standard Rubricae Phalanx. Now, last but certainly not least here are a pair of Chaos Predator Annihilators. These guys' ability, the reroll ability, procs off of attacking things that were hit by psychic attacks. Unfortunately, this particular build has a million psychic attacks running around from not only Magnus himself, but also you have 4 Aspiring Sorcerers inside the Rubricae. You have 3 more Scarab Occult Sorcerers inside the Scarab Occult Terminators. So you have tons and tons of outlets to apply this Annihilator buff without having to bend over backwards in order to do so. I really like this build. I every time Magnus gets included and it's not Grand Coven, it's kind of exciting. I know it's very difficult to get use out of him when you're not playing in Grand Coven, but it is always cool to see how people use this character. In addition to that, I also like to see these higher unit count Rubricae Phalanxes because I do think that they are more consistent. They have a broader variety of playable matchups than would typically see out of the more standard versions. Now, with that, we're going to move over to the Sydney GT Autumn. This was a 68-player event and ended up with 2 undefeated players, both of them playing Ultramarines. In this case, we'll talk about the winning list that ended up going 5-0 and taking down the event. Joe Loke played a Blade of Ultramar, which included a bunch of epic heroes, which is kind of cool. It's been a little while since we've seen the mass epic hero variety of Ultramarines, the kind of classic version, and that's what Joe was playing here today. We had Cato Sicarius, Marnius Calgar in the armor of Antilochus, in addition to Robut Gilliman and a Combi Weapon Lieutenant. No enhancements on the Combi Weapon Lieutenant there. We had an Intercessor squad for backline objective control. We had 2 Repulsor Executioners for some solid shooting, in addition to a Scout squad, 2 Victrix Honor Guard units, 2 big units of 6s, 1 Vindicator, and the Wardens of Ultramar. So we had attachments for both the armor of Antilochus, Marnius Calgar, as well as Cato Sicarius. We also have access to multiple Oaths of Moment, so we can potentially knock units down in the shooting phase with the Repulsor Executioners and the Victrix Honor Guard shooting, and then still have the second Oath of Moment being able to be used on Gilliman. The list also is rocking multiple reactive moves from Cato Sicarius' reactive move, in addition to the squad tactics, the practical tactics, I think it's called, in Blade of Ultramar. That can keep the Victrix Honor Guard alive and kicking. It's also important to note that you do have access to those Repulsor Executioners if you want to reactive move into transports, so if you are in the board state where that's available. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that the armor of Antilochus Calgar, while he normally didn't start in transports previously, because the Gravis version of Calgar usually took up 4 transport capacity between his Victrix Honor Guard and himself, so it wasn't really something you considered that often. The armor of Antilochus Calgar is still Terminator keyworded, so his Victrix Honor Guard unit takes 8 transport capacity, slightly too much for a Repulsor Executioner unless you lose a model on the way in. And then Marnius Calgar can hop in and out of a Repulsor Executioner all he wants, which is kind of fun to think about, especially given the fact that because Gilliman's here, he can't be the warlord of the army, so it doesn't really matter whether or not he's on the battlefield at the start of the turn. But otherwise, fairly standard Ultramarine stuff. Now, with that, we'll move over to a Xenos faction, Tyranids, who ended up taking down the 71-player Battle on the Bayou with a 6-0 record. In this case, Julian Hingle was playing an Invasion Fleet variety, which included a bunch of Tyrant Guard, which I think is kind of sick, and Hive Guard as well, which is pretty wild. In this case, we were running a Hive Tyrant with Adaptive Biology for his Feel No Pain, a Nero Tyrant with Synaptic Linchpin, as well as the Swarm Lord. Double Hive Tyrant variety. You absolutely love to see it. We also saw a Gargoyle unit and 2 units of Hormagaunts, so we had good access to teaming masses, so we can endless swarm models back onto the table. But the other thing is that all of these units are extremely fast and good at scenario disruption. Basically, Tyranid's best thing is being able to run gaunts onto your objective and steal your points so you don't score as many points as them. That's what they got going for them. On top of that, we saw an individual Pyrovore as well as a Biovore, plus 2 Lictors and a Neurolictor, plus a Ravener unit for utility, 1 unit of Venom Thropes to provide permanent cover to units around them, as well as situational stealth to the infantry squads, which is very relevant because we also had a Tyrant Guard unit, which is going to be able to deliver either the Swarmlord or the Hive Tyrant into the fight. I imagine it's most likely the Swarmlord, since he wants to be at the front of the fight, and then keeping these guys alive for a long while with rapid regeneration is obviously helpful, but backing that up was a Hive Guard unit. Now, what's interesting about this is that I didn't know this, but Hive Guard can actually mix and match their equipment options. They can take a combination of Impaler and Shock Cannons. Their Shock Cannons are incredibly good against vehicles. They are anti-vehicle 2+ and a flat 3 damage. The downside is that they don't have devastating wounds or natural ignore cover. That's where the Pyrovore comes in. So they can do some pretty serious damage into heavy vehicles if they do get the opportunity to shoot them without that AP being ignored. However, the downside is when you run into matchups where your opponent's not running vehicles, or they don't have that many vehicles, or their vehicles aren't that heavy, and you don't need the Hive Guard to kill them. And in that case, this list took a trio of Impaler Cannons inside the Hive Guard unit. So you still have access to those 4 Strength 5 AP1 indirect fire shots in addition to the shock cannon shooting. So you're able to harass enemy utility units and start to clear out their screens and things like that, while at the same time being able to threaten heavy vehicles. Kind of an interesting unit, plus the fact that they are a non-monster unit, which means that you get the full benefit of the Venom Throw squad. They have 4 wounds apiece, so once they commit in, you can rapid regen them. So they're protected by both stealth and a feel no pain. The unit's actually not that easy to kill, and you can start to take casualties in whichever half of the unit you don't care about. If your opponent doesn't have any light stuff that the Impaler Cannons are good into, you can just take them first, versus an army that has no vehicles, you can just lose the Shock Cannons first and allow the Hive Guard to continuously activate multiple turns. I actually think this is pretty interesting inclusion. Last in this list, we also had a Norn Emissary, so we're able to dominate the midboard. So this list puts a ton of forward pressure on your opponent. It's able to deploy relatively aggressively thanks to the Venom Thropes because it doesn't actually need cover on the table, while units like the Tyrant Guard and the Norn Emissary won't benefit from the stealth that the Venom Thropes can produce because they have the monster keyword once the Hive Tyrant's attached anyway. They can still be relatively resilient, especially once you stack that with a Feel No Pain, and being able to put 12 4-wound heavy infantry in the middle of the table, in addition to an Emissary, in addition to your being able to muck your opponent up with these Tyrants, is it's pretty cool. It's a lot of beef to try to chew through, and apparently it worked out pretty well. Very creative list. Cool to see Tyranids go 6-0 with something that is just pretty off the wall here. Now, moving back over to the Cornwall Super Bash, the event was actually won by Deathwatch, going 6-0. Chaos Space Marines ended up going 6-0 and took second based on tiebreakers. But in this case, the winner was Liam Steptoe running a Black Spear Task Force. Fairly standard stuff from Black Spear Task Force here. This included a Gravis Armored Captain with Thief of Secrets to improve his damage, a Judiciary with Beacon Angelus, plus a big melee-equipped Deathwatch Veteran unit for him to hop into, a Watchmaster with Tome of the Acticlades, and a Combi Weapon Lieutenant. We had an Intercessor Squad for Backline OBSEC, some utility from an Assault Jump Pack Intercessor unit, as well as a pair of Incursor Squads. The nice thing there is that the Incursor Squads let you not only fish for critical hits, which is a big deal, because a lot of these Deathwatch weapons tend to have lethal hits naturally. Most of their special issue bolters do. But you can also give them things like sustained hits with mission tactics. You can get a benefit for fishing for hit rolls if you hit on a 2+. So Incursor Squads are pretty big, especially on your Tome of the Acticlades turn when you have multiple Oath of Moment targets. We then also have 3 Fortis kill teams to make use of those, in addition to 2 Indomitor kill teams as well. Usually we'll see the Watchmaster attach onto one of the Fortis kill teams so they can engage a little bit earlier with Advance and Charge. Both of those characters together can unlock a total of 2 free stratagems per battle round, which allows you to both site-to-site teleport and either use mission tactics or special issue ammunition using the combination of the Watchmaster's free stratagem and the Captain's free stratagem, which makes the detachment very stratagem efficient for one that usually focuses very heavily on using tons and tons of strats over the course of the game. A very effective combination, and one that we've definitely seen before. Now we're moving over to the 53-player 4th annual Blue Ridge Championship GT. This one was won by Necrons, but we saw Dark Angels go 5-0 to take second place, this time being piloted by Aidan Barkley, who ran Wrath of the Rock. that included an interesting combination of different effects, which I think is really cool. The list, very much like the Renegade Raiders list we talked about at the beginning, is kind of the encapsulation of several different smaller sub-packages that are individually very effective. In this case, we had Asriel with a big unit of 10 Stern Guard veterans, Lionel Johnson, the Great Man himself, in addition to a Deathwing Knight squad, so they can provide a pretty solid front line. He could potentially get lone operative either from them or the combat weapon lieutenant, and anything that tries to come in and engage with that stuff ends up getting hit with a heroic intervention and fight first from Lionel Johnson. We also then have a Ravenwing Command Squad. These guys are going to attach into a big unit of Ravenwing Black Knights, which also, because they're mounted, gets the benefit of the detachment ability. I actually have a members video talking about a particular build of Wrath of the Rock that I like to take that includes a very heavy focus on these biker units, these Ravenwing units, which actually become extremely difficult to remove once you factor in the -1 to wound from the detachment ability. They have an invuln save, they have multiple wounds per model, they have regenerating models thanks to the Ravenwing Apothecary, and so that big brick can actually kind of absorb a lot of middle of the table for a really long time. We then have an Intercessor squad for backline objective secured, a Centurion Devastator squad with las cannons for a little bit of backline shooting, plus one Incursor squad and an Outrider squad for some additional utility. The Outriders are another unit that's relatively difficult to kill. In this case, these guys have 4 wounds apiece, which combined with the -1 to wound can make them stick around for a really long time, much longer than you would expect. A Scout squad, a Vanguard Veteran squad with Storm Shields, as well as a Stormspeeder Thunderstrike to get +1 to wound, especially for those Plasma Talon equipped Ravenwing Black Knights. That is an immense amount of shooting, and you can potentially give it +2 strength as well. So they could even be wounding T10 vehicles, for example, on as good as 3+, with 3 2-damage plasma shots apiece, which is pretty impressive. So all those combined can create this very aggressive list with a lot of different individual tools and a lot of these little independent packages that can all operate uniquely together, which is pretty neat. Very cool to see lists like this that incorporate the multiple different benefits of taking Dark Angels, which includes these Biker and Stormspeeder equipped units in addition to their really, really strong infantry. And speaking of strong infantry, we're going to wrap up our discussion of the Space Marine faction by moving on over to the PSSN Presents the Dark Sphere March GT. This event ended up being won by Adeptus Mechanicus, which we'll talk about later, but at second place with 5-0 record was Vincent Stein with Bastion Task Force Black Templars. In this case, this Bastion Task Force was focused on just buffing the hell out of a bunch of units of Crusaders, giant hordes of Crusader Space Marines, as befits a true Black Templar composition. This included 3 Castellan and Marshal combos, as well as the Emperor's Champion. No Chaplain Grimaldus, no High Marshal Helbrecht, none of this other stuff, no lieutenants in here. It's all Castellan Marshals for the improved critical hits, as well as those rerolls to hit that you can combo together. So we can get these Crusader squads that are attacking upwards of 80 times with full hit rerolls, 5-up critical, lethal, and sustain. Just an immense amount of damage. One of the Marshals has the Blades of Valor, and then we have Assault Intercessor squads, both for utility, and one of them for the Emperor's Champion to hop into. We also have an Intercessor squad to cover the home objective, in addition to a Scout squad for utility, and 1 Repulsor Executioner, just to make your opponent unable to deploy all their heavy tanks in the open and just assume that they're going to survive. Fairly straightforward stuff, but it's always cool to see the classic Black Templar build doing well. With Blood Surge and just the immense amount of, but not only defensive characteristics you can stack on these guys with -1 to wound, but also just the huge size of these units and how aggressive they are. This list can be very difficult to contend with if you don't have just the mass 2 wound infantry sweeping that you need to clear 60 Crusaders. You usually have to kill probably 2-ish units in 1 turn to have a chance to win against this particular build. Now, moving on to other Imperium factions, we can stick with this event to talk about the eventual winner, who was Samuel Martin running Adeptus Mechanicus in a Halo Screed Battleclade. And this weekend's lists were basically just all composed after my own heart, because Samuel in this case was running Corpuscari Electropriest, one of my favorite units. Definitely not the most efficient unit in the entire world, but I think a unit that's really cool. In this case, we were running Belisarius Kala, as well as a Tech Priest Manipulus, who can hop into that Corpuscari unit. We had 2 units of Skitarii Rangers to trigger battle line synergies, plus a Scorpius Dune Rider. The nice thing here is that this Corpuscari Electropriest can get lethal hits from the Manipulus, plus they have sustained hits too innately. You can give them 5+ criticals from the detachment, in addition to hit rerolls from Belisarius Belisarius Call, so that unit can absolutely slap when it comes to shooting something that is within 12 inches of them. They get full hit and wound rerolls if they target the call target, in addition to the benefit from fire support from the Scorpius Dune Rider. Pretty wild stuff. From there, everything else looks fairly similar. We do have an Honors Your Dune Crawler to provide a big brick in the center with an Eradication Beamer, so some solid long-range shooting. That's being backed up by 2 Iron Strider Ballistari units. We have 2 Servitor Battleclades for utility, in addition to a 5-model Zakarian Infiltrator unit and 2 5-model Zakarian Ruststalker units, plus a big unit of both 10 Zakarian Infiltrators and 10 Zakarian Ruststalkers. So we have fast onboard melee from the Ruststalkers, plus a good solid forward operating unit from the big Infiltrator squad. All of those you have to respect with their long threat range, improved critical hits, and potential advance and charge from the detachment. That's then being backed up by this just immense amount of shooting from the Electro Priests, which are almost a melee unit when you think about it, but also those Iron Strider Ballistari and Honors Your Dune Crawler. Fairly straightforward stuff, but I love to see all of these kind of off-the-wall units being used. Now moving on to a smaller event. It is only 15 players, but we'll include it here for the sake of completeness. The War Master of the Asylum, which was won by Birk Ostrand, who is playing Questoris Companions Imperial Knights, going 5-0 at the event. This included 5 big knights, and that's it. A Cerastus Knight Atropos with Wormslayer Divination, as well as Canis Rex, a Knight Gallant with Pennant of Silvered Fury, as well as a pair of Cerastus Knight Lancers, one of them with Crushing Condemnation. I do think that a lot of Knight builds are moving closer and closer to these Cerastus Knight Lancer compositions, largely because they have a strong defensive profile against basically everything incoming. The downside of Imperial Knights, if you are running standard Questoris chassis, is that they have no protection in melee. So if you hit melee-focused enemies, you can just get beat out. But Cerastus Knight Lancers not only can apply a lot of mortal wounds and high individual damage attacks, which are good against things like Catan Shards, which have a lot of damage reduction, but they are also difficult to kill versus everything. Doesn't matter what you're being attacked by, you're always going to get a 4+ chance to shake the attack. So it is unfortunate that I think it's sort of indicative of how the meta is moving, that the Imperial Knights basically just moved to maximizing 4+ invulnerable saves, but it does make a lot of sense. Speaking of maximizing 4+ invulnerable saves, we can talk about Adeptus Custodes from the North and South GT 2026. This was won by Shannon Butters, who is playing a Talons of the Emperor build. Pretty standard stuff if you've been paying attention. You've seen lists like this in the past. Obviously, Custodian Guard Squads did just get a points cost increase in the last update, which means that there are now less total Custodians on the table, but the idea behind the build is still strong. First of all, we've got 1 unit of 5, likely for Inquisitor Kyria Draxus to hop into because they make the best use of their Sentinel Storm. We then have 4 units of 4. All of these are equipped with a Vexillus model in the unit, so they can go to OC3. That lets them take objectives more easily so that they can then unlock their rerolls to wound. We have a standard Inquisitor with Blessed Wardings. We have a standard Inquisitor equipped with Blessed Wardings. This actually confused me a little bit because usually you'll see the Psyker Inquisitors get played because you get a pretty solid Devastating Wound weapon, and so being able to target enemies and gain rerolls if you're holding an objective by joining him into a Custodian Guard squad can make that Devastating Wound attack go pretty crazy. There are no joinable units that he has in the army that actually get the benefit of the warding effect, because it just gives you a 6+ invulnerable save, and everything has a 4+ invulnerable save already. He even has a better invulnerable save by himself. However, the upgrade doesn't do anything if he's by himself. It may be that we wanted to avoid granting the Psyker keyword, so anti-psychic effects didn't matter, but that feels like a lesser consideration than having a 2d6 shot Devastating Wound weapon. Or it's a typo. That could also be the thing too, so I actually have no idea. That's also being ferried to the battle by a trio of Land Raiders, and for utility, we have a Witchseeker and 3 Prosecutor squads. So lots of individual units, and otherwise fairly standard Talons of the Emperor stuff. Now moving over to the 60-player GT Asturias. This was won by Gonzalo Peña Manterola, who is playing Death Guard, in this case a fairly standard Mortarian's Hammer build. This one, importantly, gives you access to afflictions on enemies that are more than 12 inches away from you at the start of the battle round, which allows you to aggressively drop Death Shroud Terminators onto people, which is kind of a big deal. In this case, we had a Biologus Putrefire, 2 Lords of Contagion, and a Lord of Virulence, so we have attachments for all of our Death Shroud Terminators. Importantly, the Lord of Virulence does not have Tendrilless emissions in this build, so he's probably joining a Death Shroud Terminator unit, and then he can drop in out of Deep Strike and then use his ability on something that he can see once in on the table, making use of the Death Shroud ability to 6-inch Deep Strike off afflicted enemies in order to get better lines of sight is the potential. We then have a Malignant Plaguecaster with Bile Blaw Might and a Tallyman for some command point regeneration. In addition to that, we do have an attachment for that Malignant Plaguecaster, that being a unit of 10 Plague Marines that can act as a very strong late-game presence. We have a Chaos Rhino to ferry them to the table, and then a Poxwalker unit for some infiltration. Otherwise, we have a ton of standard Mortarian's Hammer units, 3 units of 3 Death Shroud Terminators to carry those Lords of Contagion around and make use of the proactive affliction in order to teleport near enemies. 3 heavy Blight Launcher Fetid Blow Drones, 3 Myphitic Blight Haulers for shooting, and to make use of the rerolls from the Lord of Virulence as well. Death Guard weren't the only Chaos Legion to do well this week, because we had an insane list from World Eaters at the Black Crow Gaming Battle of the Ragnar GT March. This was a 30-player event, was won by Sam Dickinson running, wait for it, GORETRACK Onslaught. A detachment I don't know if we've basically almost ever seen have competitive success, but the metagame is absolutely wide open right now. And so all sorts of stuff's doing well, apparently. In this case, we're running a Demon Prince of Khorne, Karn the Betrayer, a Master of Executions with aggressive deployment. That allows him to grant any transport that he is embarked in the 9-inch scout effect. This is obviously incredibly good for early alpha strikes, but importantly, does not require that the character be the only embarked unit, nor does it require him to be leading a unit. It just requires that he is inside the transport and the transport is dedicated, which means that we do have a unit of 10 Khorne Berserkers plus Karn the Betrayer. You can attach Karn the Betrayer to the Khorne Berserkers, then embark both them and the Master of Executions into a Rhino, grant that Rhino a 9-inch scout, then use full throttle assault to allow units to disembark from the Rhino and charge after the Rhino has moved. So you can move 21 inches on the first turn between Scout and the standard movement, disembark 3 inches, and you get +1 to charge from the GORETRACK Onslaught detachment ability when you disembark a transport, meaning the total threat range for this Rhino on turn 1 is 25 plus 2d6 inches, an absolutely insane capacity to alpha strike. We also then have a Slaughterbound with Infernal Infusion to grant his unit a once per game use of Fight First, which makes them a good follow-up threat to this Alpha Strike from Khorne Berserkers or other aggressive units. We have a Chaos Land Raider, largely for its ability to smash through walls in this detachment for 1 command point. We have a 3-model unit of 8-bound, as well as a 12-model unit of Exalted 8-bound. These guys could be being delivered by the Land Raider itself because of its ability to embark up to 6 possessed models into it, and then gain the benefit of that lance and +1 to charge from the detachment ability. I don't know for sure, though. We also have a Forge Fiend, 3 Hellbrutes, and a Jackal Squad. Absolutely insane list. Pretty cool to see GORETRACK Onslaught doing well. That big brick of Khorne Berserkers with the characters gaining that charge bonus and that early game aggression and lance is huge. Plus, all of the effects that allow this army to react using its abilities, to reactive move with those vehicles after they're attacked, which can set up weird interactions with Hellbrutes, for example. If you are shot at with a Hellbrute, don't lose it, then reactive move forward to unlock a heroic intervention in a weird spot. You can then create a Hellbrute chain kind of out of nowhere. You have the ability to both embark units into your transports at the end of the fight phase, either player's fight phase, so you can cycle your units in and out of transports, and if you're then able to do that before your opponent goes to shoot, you can then blood surge your Khorne Berserkers out of their Rhino in order to mess up your opponent's shooting phase. There's lots of tiny technical interactions inside this attachment that's incredibly strong. It's all turned on by the Demon Prince, obviously, to give you access to free stratagems, so we can use multiple of those on the top of the first turn or threaten multiple of them in the first battle round, which can make this list very difficult to engage with, much more so than a standard Berserker Warband style list, obviously, with the downside being that it's not quite as straightforward and high output as a Berserker Warband. Sticking with the Chaos theme for a while here, we can move on over to the Wheat City Open, a 65-player 6-round event, which is won by Logan Antonation, who won it with a Scintillating Legion build. Now, this Scintillating Legion is a little bit different than the ones we typically see. It's not focused entirely on Lords of Change, instead using large numbers of horror units in order to consistently score. This includes Be'lakor, Kairos Fate Weaver, one Infernal Puppeteer Lord of Change, as well as one Standard Lord of Change. So we still have 3 big birds plus Be'lakor to protect them from return fire shooting. However, we're then also bringing 2 Fluxmasters, one of them with the Inescapable Eye. That allows this guy to sit back and passively generate you flux tokens so you can keep up your multiple stratagems over the course of the game, which is helpful in alternative to the builds that simply run this on a Lord of Change, because that means if that Lord of Change ends up dying, you can run the risk of running out of flux tokens before you've really gotten all your damage done. Now, the other thing the Fluxmasters do is that they can deal a little bit of damage themselves. They actually have an auto dice flip effect that they can use on a devastating wound weapon, which is kind of nice. But they also give their attached unit -1 to be hit. So the big thing here is that if we have a unit of pink horrors, we can use Delirium Unmade to teleport those guys around the table, even if they're engaged. And given the fact that pink horror unit is as difficult to kill as it is, with effectively 35 wounds on a 4+ invulnerable save, alongside -1 to be hit, it's incredibly difficult to kill this thing. It's going to be able to consistently steal objectives from people and then teleport itself back into safety or hop into reserve to then rapid ingress or jump in later on during the game. An incredibly annoying unit to deal with. That's compounded by a blue horror unit, which can forward, operate, infiltrate in order to get early game secondaries complete or to threaten enemy objectives very early, plus a Plague Bearer squad to obsect the backline. We then have 2 Screamer units and a Beast of Nurgle for some additional utility. So much more scoring focused than the 4 or 5 greater demon builds that we'll typically see from this that are focused almost entirely on getting work out of Lords of Change. This list is a little bit more on the scoring side than a regular Scintillating Legion. Now, moving on to some Xenos armies, let's talk about Tau Empire and the use of their new Twin Lance. This comes from the 30-player Kelpie Crusade, which was won by Ryan Kerr. Ryan was playing a Mont Ka detachment, including Commander Shadowsun, a Kroot Flesh Shaper with Strike Swiftly. It's kind of an interesting place for that enhancement to go. You can either just infiltrate the Flesh Shaper unit by himself. You don't really actually have to embed him in anywhere. He does grant a Feel No Pain to a Kroot Carnivore squad if you are attaching him, but it's not necessary. He still infiltrates and scouts all on his own, so you could potentially use this effect to infiltrate him up the table and use him as a delivery system for the Strike Swiftly scout effect onto already infiltrating units, which can give you some crazy early game flexibility. We do have 2 Kroot Carnivore squads in the list, however, so we have tons and tons of scouting units already, in addition to the Twin Lance, another scouting unit. On top of that, we have a Crisis Starscythe Battlesuit unit, this one equipped with Tau Flamers to act as a little bit of an infantry sweeper, 1 Pathfinder team with a recon drone for an additional scouting and infiltrating unit, 3 Piranhas, so additional scouts, 2 Riptide Battlesuits, 2 units of Stealth Battlesuits, and last but certainly not least, wait for it, 1 Storm Surge. The Storm Surge has gotten a lot of discussion recently with its discounted points values. Having access to Strike Swiftly on Titanic or Towering units allows it to get absolutely bizarre lines of sight around the table that your opponent might not necessarily expect, especially with early game assaults from the Mont Ka detachment ability. Being able to scout this thing forward, then advance, then tap terrain in order to get shots is absolutely sick. And in this case, we were running a Pulse Blast Cannon, so we have access to that 4 flat damage anti-heavy infantry shot or the 2 12 damage focused fire shots. So it's good into a wide variety of targets and has the ability to really push right up the middle of the table and force engagement on turn 1. This is absolutely insane. It's just able to force so much beef down your opponent's throat between all the Piranhas, the Twin Lance, and of course this Storm Surge that can all be running into your opponent's, the midboard of the table at the very least, and potentially even your opponent's objective, being backed up by Kroot and Pathfinders and all these infantry as well. It's able to basically put its entire beef into the center of the battlefield and just ask your opponent what they're going to do about it. Pretty wild stuff. Now, with that, we'll move over to the 22-player Mons GT, which was won by Carla Tukia, who was playing Orks. In this case, an Orc War Horde, but with some interesting inclusions. A very Beast Snagga heavy composition here, with 3 Beast bosses and 3 units of Beast Snagga boys, in addition to a kill rig to carry at least one of those combos around the battlefield. We do have Gaskell Thraka and a unit of 20 boys, alongside Boss Snickrot and a Big Mac. So we have Follow Me Lads on the Big Mac, so we can dual attach with Gaskell Thraka, the classic combo, plus Snickrot for some early game secondary play. We do have 3 units of 5 flash kits for some additional utility and disruption pieces, 1 Gretchen unit for the backline and for command point generation, plus 3 trucks to carry these units around, 1 unit of commandos for additional utility. We do also have a beast boss on Squigosaur to kind of complete the beast Snagga theme of this build. No attachment for him, but he does have 8 wounds with a 5+ feel no pain. He's not the easiest thing in the world to kill. And while he doesn't have any unit to lead, so he doesn't get his +1 to charge, he is running Head Wop as Kill Choppa, so he's going to be able to deal some pretty consistent anti-monster, anti-vehicle devastating wounds, which is pretty nice. Being able to get up to 7 anti-vehicle devastating attacks from his Choppa alone is pretty cool for the extremely low points investment that this guy is. Only 130 points for a relatively speedy individual model. They're coming in at a high OC. They have 9 base attacks, and that can only go up with either the Warhorde detachment ability, getting sustained hits, or obviously the WOG improving the attack characteristic of his Choppa. All of those are pretty good, and he operates independently from the other Beast Snagga units, and especially in a vehicle or monster-focused metagame, having mass access to all of these devastating wound anti-monster, anti-vehicle weapons can only be helpful. Now we're going to round things out here with discussion of Spectacle of Spite from the 20-player VT 40K GT March. This was won by Chris Minette, who was playing Drukhari, obviously. This included an Archon, Lady Malice, Lilith Esperanx, a Succubus with Morgana's Curse, as well as a Succubus with the Chrono Shard. We had 4 units of Witches to act as disruption, to benefit from all the Spectacle of Spite detachment abilities, the combat drugs that they get, in addition to their end-of-phase charging, plus a Cabalite Warrior squad for objective secured. These can be combat squadded into Venoms. There are 3 Venoms in the list, as well as a Raider to carry around one of the larger units. 2 units of 10 Hellions for some really heavy-duty counterpunch, plus a smaller 5-model unit of Hellions for some utility, 1 unit of 3 Reavers for some additional utility, and 2 Darklance heavy weapon Scourge squads. And with that, those are all of the best armies of Warhammer 40k for this week. Gonna level with you, probably one of my favorite weeks of competitive 40k discussion that we've had in a really long time, because these lists are so creative. We have seen maybe a little bit of a break in the monotony of the meta of the last couple of months, and now things are being shaken up. We see all of these kind of off-the-wall units and things being taken. I'm interested to see how well Chaos Space Marines do in the future, whether or not they are truly our new metagame overlords. It does seem like it's trending that way, but we'll see how things go. But thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports Tactical Tortoise, whether that's over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.